And so we're going to jump straight in to This Week in Macro, part 2 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 93. Did Google and China ban Bitcoin? Right, so let's take a look at some of the stats. A lot of economic data is coming out. The trends that we've been covering over the long term in Bitcoin Hard Talk are becoming more and more clear. And I'll go through some of those trends. Now, firstly, let's have a look at the US national debt. So now, for the very first time in the last couple of weeks, the US national debt has officially passed $37 trillion for the very first time in history. Obviously, every debt is a new first time in history. It sounds very dramatical, but $37 trillion. This basically puts total US debt up by $780 billion since the debt ceiling was raised, which was done with the Big Beautiful Bill, the signing of the Big Beautiful Bill under the Trump administration, and that was only on July the 4th. $780 billion since July the 4th. This basically equates to an average rise of $22 billion per day. The US national debt is increasing at $22 billion per day from the Trump administration, whose whole promise was to get a trade surplus and pay down the national debt, and is now going into more debt than the Biden administration, because anyone that watches Bitcoin Hard Talk, you never got fooled by that for a section, because you know that the dollar is a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and as soon as you start paying down the debt, you constrict the money supply and you crash the whole economy. Debt has to go up exponentially forever in a debt-based Ponzi scheme until you tackle monetary reform, not tax reform. And so last week alone, the government basically sold 725, this is in 1 week, $1 billion of treasuries through 10 auctions. They had to do 10 auctions to sell $750 billion of a debt-based Ponzi scheme. The US household debt, it jumped by $185 billion in Q2 2025. So now, US households, of the 330 million Americans, you now have $18.39 trillion of debt. That is what happens when the dollar is debt and the interest to repay the debt doesn't exist. And the only way to repay that debt is to issue more debt, both on the consumer level, the corporate level, and the government level. The government is done through wars. The corporate is done through financial engineering, and the closer you are to the money printer, the cheaper the interest you get, 0%. The further you are from the money printer and you're spending on consumption, you pay like 40% payday loans and 27-30% credit cards. And if you spend it on consumption rather than assets, you're wrecked by the system, because the system is designed to extract wealth from those that don't own assets, from those that are in debt. And that's why they need you to be in debt. You are the money supply. And it is the banks that profit from every loan in that $18.39 trillion of consumer debt. This basically puts total household debt up by $592 billion in just the last year. This surge was driven by mortgages, and so obviously people are becoming debt slaves for life. And Bitcoin is the new mortgage. Like, the next generation that couldn't get on the property ladder are trying to figure out how to beat the market so that they can take on a mortgage and be a debt slave for life to drive the profits of the proof of weapons network. And mortgage debt rose $131 billion in the second quarter. That is $12.94 trillion of mortgages. You are the product. You are creating the dollar, but the banks get the profit and you get the enslavement. And hopefully your real estate beats the market but Bitcoin beats that anyway and drains the swamp. And so they want to get your Bitcoin so that you can borrow against it. Anyway, what about credit card debt? Credit card debt is up $27 billion in the same time period. That's $1.21 trillion of dollars were created by you swiping that card, just shy of a complete all-time high. What about students? Students, you're the product. They need you to start buying those degrees so that you can go into debt, so that you can take on the mortgage, so that you can take on the credit card, so that the banks can make all the money of the dollar. And if you consume it, you're a slave to them for life. So student and auto loans debt, it has now climbed to $7 billion in the same time period. That's up $13 billion to $1.64 trillion. And auto loans as well. That's the student debt. Auto loans is another $1.66 trillion as well. And both of those are all-time high records. So while artificial intelligence is teaching you what a degree could never teach you, you're taking on more and more student debt that takes 3 years, that in that whole time you could have been adjusting to AI, stacking more Bitcoin every month, and instead you're stacking more debt every month, getting further behind and hoping that the government inflates away your debt. Americans are piling on the debt. The entire economy is based upon debt, which is why BlackRock and the Proof of Weapons Network are pivoting to the countries, because you're so enslaved by debt that you can't afford to have children. And when you can't afford to have children, they need a workforce. They need to replace you with artificial intelligence and robots, and they need to work with the global south and the countries that are still having children as well, which is why there is no America first agenda. There is no Europe first agenda. There is no UK first agenda. So what is happening with all of this debt? Well, we covered it in a couple of weeks ago, consumer price index inflation. Nothing was really happening there. We're waiting to see the impact of tariffs. But this week, we had the producer price inflation. And the producer price inflation, while the consumer price inflation was about 2.7%, so it's rising above the 2% target, the producer price inflation was 3.3%. That is significantly higher than expected. That's why we had a correction in the market. And just so you know, this is the cost of goods for businesses that are producing goods. The vast majority of the American economy is services, so it doesn't really impact those people there. But if you're a business and you're producing goods, the price of those goods is going up, and it's now 3.3%, significantly higher than expected. Now, this is normally a leading indicator to what consumer price index will be. Imagine if all of the goods prices are going up to produce a good, then you can imagine they're going to start passing on some of those costs and charge increase in prices. And so normally this indicates that we're going to have consumer price inflation, currently 2.7%, but it's likely to go higher as well, above the 3%. Now, there's not a perfect science to that as well, because when you are enslaved and indebted, where, 1% control all the wealth, and there's about 10% that do the vast majority of all the consumption, and 90% are, just living and meeting standards, and about 60% are living month to month as debt slaves, then you can imagine that when you put prices up, you just can't afford it anymore. So the top 10% will buy whatever the price is. They're price inelastic is called in economics. They don't care. Whatever the price is, they'll buy it because they got the money. But those that can't afford it, they just essentially stop consuming. And so it may not necessarily be that it turns into consumer price inflation, because it may crowd out demand. And this is called demand destruction. And demand destruction impacts businesses. And then you have a deflationary effect, where the price of goods go down because, there's less goods, or there's too much money chasing too few goods if they do a monetary stimulus like the Trump administration has been doing with all these auctions. And so you may get some offsetting effects. But anyway, that's what The inflation, I'm still expecting inflation to continue in the direction as a monetary phenomenon and also a one-time reaction over the next year or so to the tariffs, depending on what happens with those tariffs as well. The issue is that when inflation is going up and stocks are going up, there's no real justification for the Fed to cut rates. Now, Trump wants the rates to be cut because he wants to roll over all the debt with short-term treasuries and refinance so you're paying less interest. It's still a debt-based Ponzi scheme, but he's trying to do that. So the Federal Reserve cutting rates is the complete opposite of what their mandate does. And if they do that, because Trump is asking for massive rate cuts, essentially the rich are going to get richer, the poor are going to get poorer. And if you don't own any assets, then you're going to be on the wrong side of this further and further, which drives America further and further into civil unrest. And so that's the strategy that the Trump administration is following. The Trump administration wants to pump the stock market, which is essentially tariffs are a subsidy on American consumers. And if you end up using monetary policy to pump the stock market anyway, then you're transferring wealth from Main Street to Wall Street all over again. And so with this goal in mind, what is Trump doing? Well, he announced and nominated his new person to enter the Federal Reserve. And there's another 3 people that will be retiring. And then there's going to be the new chairman to replace Jerome Powell, who has to retire, I think, in June next year. And so there was an announcement that Dr. Stephen Moran is going to be replacing one of those people that wanted to cut rates for Trump, but instead stepped down. And now we've got a new vacant that Trump has been essentially put to that role. So what do we know about him? Well, we know that he's pro-Bitcoin. He's been posting posts on X around Bitcoin. So we've now got people in the Fed that are pro-Bitcoin. We know that Moran, from his previous papers, he has a very aggressive stance on rates and basically, different trade policies as well. Way more aggressive than Jerome Powell. And I think he could be potentially a movement towards the shadow Fed chair. And what that means is that the market will react to what they think the Fed will do when Jerome Powell steps down, and therefore whatever Jerome Powell does is useless, which means that he's much less likely to decrease those rates, even though there is a high percentage that in September you'll get a token rate decrease. But it won't do anything because it's the long-term rates that matter. And then we may have this shadow Fed chair. He's proposed radical changes in the Federal Reserve. So as we're moving to this stablecoin standard, and the Genius Act allows banks to turn their reserves at the Federal Reserves into stablecoins. I covered that a couple of weeks back in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 92. And I believe that he has a policy of a weaker dollar. And so pushing down the value of the dollar is the stated goal, I believe, from what we can tell based upon his previous papers as well. And so we're expecting to get an announcement of the shortlist of the shadow Feds or people that will take the role. And I think he was going to put out 11 people, and people will ignore it, and people will speculate. But we may get an announcement anytime soon. And really, what does that do? Well, it basically removes the long-term policy of Fed independence. And Fed independence means that it could be very bearish for the dollar. And the cost to borrowing, if you want to lend to the government for 10 years and 30 years, is likely to go up if this actually happens. So this is a great MAGA narrative. You can say, I'm taking on the Fed. We're going to replace it, and we're going to make America great again. And we're going to take down the Fed. And Treasury is going to be issuing these stable coins. But it's a significant weakening of the dollar, which if you've been watching any of my content, I've said Trump is installed to move the world to multipolar world, to make America more isolationist, and to have massive destabilization campaigns based upon a MAGA narrative. And I'm not going to go through that again. I've covered that so many times. So what is Trump saying? He wants a 300 basis point rate cut. Never been done before. Unprecedented. The Fed has never been doing it. But does this make it more likely to happen? Maybe. We can speculate. But now, even though inflation is on the rise and stocks are on the rise, and there's no justification for decreasing rates based upon the data, the poly markets and the betting markets and the markets are saying there is a 93% chance that the Fed will cut rates in September. So it's highly likely to be either a quarter cut or a half, 500 basis. But the market might start moving as if Fed independence is no longer there. That all ties into the dollar destabilization campaign and many of the different things that I believe is happening that seem to be rolling out right now. So in line with the destabilization campaign, what have we had this week and maybe even last week? Let me come through. Let me just try and catch up. It's virtually impossible to keep up to date with this stuff. So I'm going to try and do some of it for you, but by no means is all of this. You'd have to follow me on X, where I go live every single day and do live spaces where you can come up and ask me questions to really get this in real time, because it's moved so fast that even I can't keep up. So here we go. This week or last week or however, I can't keep up anymore. Trump has doubled tariffs on Indian imports by 50%. He has also added a new 15% tariff on Japanese goods. He has declared a 100% tariff on semiconductors, the most important strategic asset for both military and tech. He exempted South Korea and Taiwan from these. And so really it was just targeted at China. But China doesn't really export any of them to America. So it's completely meaningless. It's just a destabilization campaign anyway, because they're not being exported to America. He warned that pharmaceutical tariffs are going to be as high as 250% and that they're on their way. And while adding a tariff on India, which is the country that America's dependent upon for its pharmaceutical products and drugs, as well as being dependent upon China for its rare earth minerals and Taiwan's for its semiconductor chips. He managed to essentially take the DXY, the dollar index, against a basket of other currencies, mainly the euro, the Swiss franc, and the Japanese yen, and various other currencies, that had a rebound above 100. He managed to get it below 100 again and back under because of these destabilization campaigns. So it had a big rally up and then came straight back down. It's now playing around the $98 level as well. The stock market did not give a damn. It continued to have crashing stocks for the majority of stocks. We're talking big names. So the American companies are suffering, but the tech companies are crushing it, pushing up the entire index and consolidating more and more of the S&P 500 into the S&P 10. Now, the bond market does care. The bond market is the truth. You can't fool the bond market. And so we said that there were all of these auctions in order to refinance the debt. We had the largest issuance of 4-week bonds in US history. So more of the debt is being refinanced into 4-week bonds, which are going to have to be refinanced again in another 4 weeks. And we also had a $42 billion 10-year auction. So that's the 10-year bonds that want to lend to the US government. They had to sell at a discount in the Dutch auction. So the demand just wasn't there. Now, because it's a Dutch auction, they always get sold out. But you can read a little bit more into it. International buyers were significantly down. That means America is refinancing on itself, onto its banks, onto its primary dealers, onto its pension funds, onto its Cayman Island funds, rather than foreign companies. So it's having to be repackaged onto itself and onto Americans. So you are the product if you're contributing to your pension as well. There was an increase in the basically the buyers of last resort. That's the primary dealers. So the primary dealers, they commit to stepping in if the demand isn't there. There was a massive increase in terms of the numbers that were in the primary dealers as well. And so that is the first signs of these auctions being highly stressful, which is why they're pushing through all these stable coins and they're trying to do radical monetarism as we enter into this fiscal dominant strategy of Trump trying to spend its way through stimulus and pump the market and push the wealth inequality gap further and further and further away as the debt gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Right. Now, isn't the trade policy meant to be taking down China? So let's have a look. I said that the tariff policy would draw everyone closer to China and that China could outlast America in a trade war massively because only 15% of China's economy is exports to America. And China has been working on its Belt and Road Initiative in order to not destroy countries, but to invest in companies, make them more vassalized and dependent, a bit like the IMF strategy. But instead of doing the IMF strategy, allow the countries to do what they want to do and build up their own infrastructure rather than IMF loans to completely destroy the economy. This is driving people to closer relationships with China after decades and decades of IMF economic hitmen from America. And so what is happening now? Well, China's surplus, which was meant to be hit by tariffs, is surging. Remember what I said? This will draw people closer to China and get it less dependent upon the American economy so it can be more isolationist while the global institutions gobble up all of the companies that are going to be distressed, the smaller companies that are having mass bankruptcies right now. And China will continue to grow. And so their surplus is surging. So China's overall global trade surplus reached a record of $1.2 trillion over the last 12 months during this quote unquote trade war. Now, I said China had already won the trade war and Trump was installed in order to put a MAGA narrative on the fact that America was losing the trade war in order to reset the world order to the multipolar world order that is emerging right now. But their positive trade balance has essentially doubled over the last 5 years. So the trend has just continued and it's doubled over 5 years. This comes as China's essentially exports have significantly rebounded even after the trade policy. And this is excluding the US. So it is increasing without the US as well, which is what I said it would exactly do on Liberation Day and beyond. The cumulative 12-month exports for the world right now, and if you exclude the US, they have increased by $400 billion to a record $3.2 trillion over the last 18 months, over the Biden administration, over the trade tariff policies, and over the trade war to where it is right now. Now, you could say China manipulates numbers, and there's an element of truth to that, just as America manipulates numbers, but China is not subjected to the same audit requirements. And so you can take these numbers with a grain of salt, but directionally it's obvious. So additionally, China's cumulative 12-month manufacturing surplus hit a record of $2 trillion, which is well above the largest surplus historically seen in Germany and Japan. So Germany is destroying its manufacturing base. Japan, during its peak, when it was creating all these trade surplus, it still has massive trade surpluses, even despite the debt, which makes it different to America. America has the world reserve currency, a twin fiscal deficit and trade deficit, which is pretending to pay off, but it would crash the world. China has its debt to itself in an internal banking system without a debt-based Ponzi scheme because it's got a state banking system, but massive trade surpluses and reserves. Whereas Japan has the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, but it has massive asset surpluses, but America doesn't have those. Now, yes, it has a growing productive economy through its industry, but it's not the interest rate on its debt is faster than its growth, which is why we're in this spiral where America's basically trade deficit is where it was during the Great Depression, during wartime, and it's its record of 6% without the manufacturing base that it had in order to recover the economy. So China is essentially expanding global trade amid US tariffs. Exactly what I said it would do. And I said US Liberation Day is liberating the world from the dollar. And we covered some of the de-dollarization slow trends as well. So what did China do in reaction to this? China ordered basically its tech companies, including ByteDance and Alibaba and Tencent, which are their large equivalents of Google and everything as well, and Amazon, basically to suspend the Nvidia chip purchases, even though Trump signed off on exporting those chips to China because it wanted to subsidize its GDP and increase the stock price of Nvidia. And China came along and said, stop buying them. It's a national security risk. We don't trust those chips. And so obviously they have something going on in terms of their own chips or whatever it is that they're working on. Now, all that tariffs has done is, yes, there has been an increase in revenue for America, which is $350 billion, but Americans and American companies paid for it. So this is a tax and wealth transfer from the American people to the American government. So it's a tax increase so far. And that's the impact as well. Now, what else is it doing? It's concentrating the small to medium-sized enterprises that are having record bankruptcies into the larger corporations. That's what I said, because the larger corporations, they got global trade routes. They're able to circumvent these tariffs and they're able to rejig as well. So the top 10% largest US stocks now reflect a record 75% of all the US equity market. So you're getting massive concentration in stocks, consolidation of power into monopolies, and guess what? They're all Blackrock's portfolio companies as well. So this has officially surpassed the previous record before the Great Depression in the 1930s in terms of stock concentration, which was the debt-fueled bubble that is the Trump administration's policy, a debt-fueled bubble of the stock market. So by comparison, in the 2000 dot-com bubble, which is when my father lost all of his money in the dot-com boom and bust, and then that sent me into this obsession of studying money and going to uni and working in investment banking and working in and then leaving for monetary reform and eventually finding Bitcoin, trying to create a bank and the whole story. That was all based upon my father losing all of his money. When he asked me, son, what happened to my money? I was broke he was broke in World War II, being bombed in the UK, had no money, he was the son of a bus driver. And he managed to break from the cycle without debt, become a self-made millionaire. And then he lost it all in the stock market because he didn't understand the proof of weapons network. And that drove my obsession, kind of made me where I am. He passed away actually on the 12th of June, 2022, which was the day when Operation Choke Point 2.0 and the ex-Mossad agent, the ex-IDF soldier, Alex Majinsky, stole all that money in a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme with the hacks from Netanyahu, and the Celsius came down, and then you had the whole liquidation cycle. And then I spent 2 years trying to work with all the victims of that, like I did the Bitfinex hack victims in 2016. This was a 22,000 dot-com bubble. And that's exactly what it looks like at the moment. So back then, when we had this massive deleveraging event, pump and dump cycle, 10% of shares were only 73%. So this was slightly less, but very similar. In the 1980s, after the stagflation environment and the savings and loan crisis that followed, this was basically below 50%, and that was too leveraged as well. So meanwhile, the top 10 stocks in the S&P 500 now represent about 40% of the entire S&P index and the market capitalization. So this is massive monopolies and massive concentration of power. And that is what BlackRock wanted to do when essentially the banks and the financial industrial complex said, let's put Trump in, let's do the tariff policy, and let's reset to the multipolar world order. And obviously Trump's allowed to get rich out of it. And let's change to this technocracy and surveillance state and introduce not a Bitcoin strategic reserves as covered in part 1, but a stablecoin that is a covert CBDC, as I've often covered as well. Anyway, what about real estate? There is massive consolidation of real estate into fewer and fewer banks. And so rather than having community banks, you're having community banks going bust, gobbled up by less and less banks. So less and less productive lending, more and more mega lending, which is rampant corruption, and more consolidation of power so that the large institutions the government becomes subordinate to them. But we're starting to see more and more distressed acquisitions from managing of funds because you're handing your pension over to BlackRock rather than buying Bitcoin. So they're pushing up. The Federal Reserve still has $2 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. If they sold them, houses would be affordable for a lot of people. But instead, you got to buy Bitcoin to outperform it, and then you can eventually buy your house with Bitcoin. It's the only way to beat the market that I know of. And so we're now getting announcements that there's going to be an IPO in order to merge Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Yes, that's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the institutions that were privatized, socialization, the privatization and socialization. Let me get this right. The socialization of losses and privatization of gains. I did it. Got that one right. And so they're essentially dumping all of these federal toxic assets and mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps by doing a merger of them, which may lead to efficiency improvements, at the same time as making it public as well. Maybe they end up in your 401k, as real estate is now allowed because there's an executive order. Can you see how the lobby controls everything? And the politicians are there to wrap it up in a narrative that's acceptable to you. So we're now seeing this massive concentration of these toxic assets and mortgage-backed securities, keeping the price, keeping the real estate Ponzi going. We're seeing basically what the destabilization campaign is federal power is being reduced by the proof of weapons network. And we're having this concentration of power that is governing these different networks. And I think federal power is being removed, which was what backed the dollar. It was all the corruption. The proof of weapons network is being privatized. State federal power is being transferred to corporate power, which is exactly what the European Union was, exactly what the European Central Bank was, and exactly what happened to UK and Europe when the colonial power started imploding on itself to beta test it for what it's currently doing in the US. And this is why we're getting the isolation of the US. This is why tariffs are happening. And this is why we're getting an increasingly more unstable environment. And the narrative to make it acceptable is MAGA in the case of the US. And obviously the proof of weapons network is hosted in the US, so it impacts us all. But I think all these trends are happening that I've been saying are the long-term trends as we cover them each week. Now, what is also interesting, remember those that say, Simon, isn't this a conspiracy theory? Basically, BlackRock has become the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company. We've seen this model before, but now it is public company through BlackRock and has created this unaccountable power structure where governments are subordinate. And it can do its colonial expedition and push wars and control the deep state and even have the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is owned by the banks and the banks are owned by BlackRock. If you want to understand how the proof of weapons network, go to my blog on simondixon.com, put in proof of weapons, and you'll see a blog there with a summary and a breakdown of everything. Now, everyone says, but isn't this a cabal, or isn't this a conspiracy theory? And I tell people, no, it's just follow the money. That's what I do every single week. This is how it works. You were just lied to all along.
Yeah, we lost you about 20 seconds.
Okay. All right. So the story I was covering, let me just go right back to the beginning of the Blackrock story. Basically, there was a federal judge ruling in Texas that ruled that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street can be sued, and they basically are being sued for forming an investment cartel. Now, this is what people called me a conspiracy theorist for. When I was just telling you, we've seen this throughout history. It's not my fault that you think your government control are in charge. It's not my fault that you haven't figured out that the way more powerful force is the corporate interest and has made government subordinate to it, and they control the deep state, and they use this in order to prop up the dollar in a debt-based Ponzi scheme called the Proof of Weapons Network. But essentially, during this Texas ruling, I got AI to give me a little bit of a summary because the document was very long. But basically, the little summary it gave me is that the case was that the State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock are controlling the US energy markets. So these things that I said are now been ruled. Not so conspiracy theory now, is it? People that always debate me around how this is, some crazy conspiracy theory. So what the case said is that the lawsuit says that they bought BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard were buying coal companies, and they were buying them just to shut them down, and they were forcing them into green energy mandates. And then they would jack up the prices based upon these mandates, and then they would push an ESG narrative and an ESG policy in order to reset the flow of capital, and then nobody voted for it. And then it basically would go deeper, and it was using the exact same follow the money trends that I talk about every week in Bitcoin Hard Talk. So it's great. This is exactly what happened when I was fighting Celsius. Everyone called me a conspiracy theorist. And then in 2 years, it eventually all came out in court documents. And now we're seeing the same at the very highest level with the Proof of Weapons Network. They're not calling it the Proof of Weapons Network, but it's exactly the same. So BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, they own Tyler Tech, which was basically banned for corrupt, doing corrupt reassessments to manipulate valuations. Who were the major shareholders? It was Amazon, and it was Costco. They're the major shareholders in them. And they were using massive tax breaks by treating it like a network as well. And so at the same time as US taxes going up for everybody, they were able to use the Proof of Weapons Network in these court rulings in order to use Ireland and various other jurisdictions to pay no tax. They indirectly own shares in Demerva Power, and this is through their position in ExxonMobil. And this is why prices of energy were going up. They were manipulating oil prices, working with other forces. This led to skyrocketing bills. Who else do they own? They own shares in NVR, Ryan Homes, and this is basically buying farmland, pushing up unaffordable development projects. And these are the exact type of where I said that they create wars, rebuild, get rare earth mineral deals. They act like a cartel. The financial industrial complex negotiates with the military industrial complex, and they install changes with the technical industrial complex. They get Americans into debt to have the consumption industrial complex. And then Big Pharma gets everyone addicted to drugs through the pharmaceutical industrial complex. This is like a ruling exactly in line with the Proof of Weapons Network that some people say is a conspiracy theory. They have a heavy stake in, Chesapeake Utilities, and Efrasian Water. And so they control assets. They ruin economies. They push them into distressed asset sale. They strip out the assets that are core to the country. They create destabilization campaigns, open borders, deportations. They have privatized prison industries. They have privatized militarization. This is what we're seeing. All of this was, showed in that. And so they have these water companies, they have these monopolies where they can hold the countries to ransom. It's just basically a triangle of a profit scheme. And exactly as I said, financial terrorism. They control land, they control utilities, they control politics. They use lobby in order to push out the proof of weapons network. They get to have the companies that benefit from printing the money. They get to push everyone into debt through all of this debt enslavement schemes. And it's all controlled by the same few players, Blackrock, State Street, and Vanguard. And if you read my blog where I said, but when you talk about the proof of weapons network, aren't you talking about the Jews? And I told them, no, look at the myths. That's the blame shift. They weaponize ideology to recruit armies. They'll weaponize Christianity. They'll weaponize Zionism. They'll weaponize Muslim invasion. They'll create fund groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda. They'll fund militias. And they're using the same techniques on the West right now that they've been using all along through the covert regime change and operations. So it's not a conspiracy anymore. It's now backed up by federal rulings. So it's good to see that following the money actually works. And it's why so often at Bitcoin Hard Talk, we're able to share with people things that people would just find unreasonable normally. It's just because they don't follow the money. And by the way, if you buy into the Jewish conspiracy theory that they all rule it, check out my blog that I created. Just put Jews in the blog section, and I go through the real data, follow the money. Look at the IMF, look at all the accusations, look at the banks, look at who's controlling them, look who actually benefits, look at the religious ideologies that are weaponed. We got to get to the truth in order to get to the solution, because they like to obfuscate reality so that you can't see what's happening right in front of you. So this is the proof of weapons network that I've always been describing. And what is the stated goals, I believe, that we're seeing by following the money? And that is that Europe and the UK are getting worse and worse and worse. The proof of weapon network is fully in control of those governments, is turning the entire region into distressed, toxic assets, just like it had done with the IMF in the global south and the Middle East and Asian regions and Latin America. It's turning them into distressed, toxic assets for acquisition. You only need to look at what numbers did we get from Germany. Their manufacturing industry is down 2%. They're making ever more stupid moves, and MERS was installed because it's harder to vassalize Germany because they have their own manufacturing base. But this is why the proof of weapons network gets involved in political interference. They fund the media, and they make you think that the trends that you're seeing are the things you need to focus on so that they can turn your country into a toxic asset. And this is the largest decrease since COVID. COVID was an operation. I'm not even sure if we're allowed to say that anymore. And so we're getting the Bank of England cutting rates to 4% at the moment, trying to stimulate growth. We had a massive exodus leading into October in the UK. All of the millionaires leaving, all of the billionaires leaving people that the tax revenue is decreasing. We're getting people that are creating their own private security because the police aren't doing their jobs anymore. They're implementing exit taxes so that if after October you can't leave the country without giving them all of your assets as well and a percentage of your assets, they're doing what America did. America made it where you can't leave. You just have to pay tax forever. And so they're all leaving before, because they can't do it in backward. They can only do it forward. And where are they all heading? They're headed to the UAE. They're headed to the Middle Eastern countries. And where is UAE? UAE is a member of BRICS. BRICS, the same BRICS that Goldman Sachs talked about in order to isolate America, reset the world order into a multipolar world order, because America is just simply the host nation for the capital market. And now they control government and they install the politicians, and Trump is there to deliver that reset in the world order. We're seeing already that as a result of this, as a result of Trump's tariffs, Brazil, India, and China, they're basically all coming together And they're deciding we're going to respond to tariffs in a more unified approach. Now that they're doing their trade deals together without the dollar, they're doing de-dollarization in terms of their multilateral trade agreements. And Russian President Putin basically immediately after Trump said we'll put the increased tariffs on India, went to visit India. And so immediately you had a close, more close ties with BRICS rather than the traditional thing. And then what are you seeing from BlackRock? BlackRock is getting Trump to negotiate deals to asset strip Americans so that all of the money is consolidated into the top stocks. India then basically came out and said that it's now not going to buy US arms. It's got a plan in order to, basically halt the purchasing of all those weapons that it was buying. And BlackRock gets to manage its portfolio into the different areas. And then guess what? A new trade deal will be done, which means that the tax revenue doesn't come in, but the large companies get the deal anyway that they were looking for. And again, Main Street pays, Americans pay, you get the inflation, and then the deals go up to the top as well. India said that it's not going to be buying multiple aircrafts. It's not going to be buying vehicles. It's not going to be buying missiles anymore. India's defense minister came out and canceled its plans to visit the US. Remember Apple as well. We were told that Apple is going to relocate away from China and start building its manufacturing base in India. So first, Apple decided that it's going to begin moving the iPhone production away from China and over to India. And that was to avoid the 140% tariff that was then reversed immediately, and we got the extension. 1 month later, we're told that Trump is now threatened to impose a 25% tariff on iPhones that are not made in the US. And so then Apple suddenly reacts and says, okay, we won't build in India. And so as soon as this situation is settled down, Apple decided that it's going to announce a $600 billion investment in the US to support Trump's trade initiatives. But what is that going to do? The massively more expensive iPhones, and the vast majority is going to be negotiated out through its large multinational corporations. And essentially, the increase in the price of iPhones is the consumer will pay, and it goes to the government. You're making the government bigger. This is increasing the size of government, and it's not even paying down its debt. It's one big, ginormous debt-based Ponzi scheme to prop up the final parts of the proof of weapons network while all the politicians are exiting into Bitcoin and giving America no Bitcoin strategic reserves. So hours later, Apple decided to release the news that tariffs on India is basically rising. I think the administration said they're rising to 50% because India is buying oil from Russia, and yet they're buying it for Europe. And America can't produce the oil they're saying in these numbers. We've covered all of that last week or the week before. I don't want to go through that again. And so basically months and months of, doing these, sitting down, is, shutting down manufacturing from China, deciding that it's going to be doing plans to relocate to India. The entire initiative is basically effectively made worthless by a single executive order based upon the whims. This is the destabilization campaign. And then Apple just sits down with Trump and, signs a memorandum of understanding. But I think we understand, if you watch Bitcoin Hard Talk, that it's not going to be anything that they're telling you anyway. So all this to say, this is playing out exactly as we covered in Bitcoin Hard Talk. We said Liberation Day will be liberating the world from the dollar. And so you're getting the consolidation, to reiterate what I said back then, of small to medium-sized companies into BlackRock portfolio companies. We're getting the pushing of trade over to BRICS. We're getting the isolation of US into a more vassalized state that is controlled by BlackRock's portfolio companies with governments as subordinates. And in order to manage the civil unrest that comes from the wealth inequality, we're getting the surveillance state and the police state that is progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And so Trump did his next initiative. He said, right, we're going to militarize the police in DC. we're going to push out all the criminals. Some cheer, some get scared, and we end up with another beta test of a destabilization campaign, just like we saw in LA, and we'll be covering what happens next week as a result of it. So this is, I think, a good summary of everything that's coming. I'm going to be doing a blog next week breaking down the specific numbers and exactly the impact of the tariff policies so far. But so far, the government has taken in $350 billion, and inflation is going up to producer price index of 3.3%. And the auction is getting ever more desperate to refinance the debt as the government's debt increases to $37 trillion and beyond. And consumers, auto loans, mortgages, they're all going up in value. And we get 401ks, your pension being dumped on, and Bitcoin being the only asset that you can have in order to protect yourself. So what I'd encourage you, if you just watch part 2 this week in macro, please, please, please go back to part 1, because I've given a guide on exactly how to self-custody and protect yourself from these trends and everything you can do to protect yourself. So we're now going to be moving into part 3 of this week in Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 93, this week in Bitcoin, where we covered basically the Google ban, the China ban, and the Bitcoin strategic reserves and self-custody and how to protect yourself. And we covered in this section the update on the trade policies, the debt, and the inflation figures. And now we're going to be moving over to, by following the money, what's happening in the geopolitical side as well. We use the same methodology. We don't listen to what they say. We follow the money so that we can get ahead and we can start to try and predict, based upon the deals that are being done, what's really happening, so that we can understand that Europe is where the military industrial complex wants to make its profits, because the financial industrial complex wants to make more money out of the Middle East. And therefore, there is a reset of the world order and a blame shift campaign that's happening as we have the destruction and isolation of US and vassalization of Israel. And I'd like to start with a comedy video, which we're going to play in part 3. But just before we play that, if you are not a subscriber on my YouTube channel, we have broken 101,000 subscribers. And we got our silver plate. So thank you to all of you for getting us there. We're trying to get to 210,000 subscribers as the next goal, because 21 is our favorite number with Bitcoin, to eventually get to 1 subscriber for every Bitcoin, 21 million eventually. Hopefully I don't lose my voice before we get there. So please do subscribe if you're not a subscriber already. If you're enjoying this content, I give lots of free resources to make sure you're prepared for this world of Bitcoin, AI, stablecoins, and central bank digital currencies. Also, subscribe and follow me over on Rumble. We're building a little bit of a following there in case we need to switch there, because they're now doing Litecoin, Bitcoin payments and all sorts of interesting things. And head over to simondixon.com, get a free login to my membership portal, so that you can get all the training and guides to prepare for this world for free. Also, make sure if you use Apple, go to Apple Podcasts, and you can download this and watch the whole 3 hours and 3 parts in a more manageable fashion. You can do the same on Spotify. And if you want to come up and ask me a question, follow me on X, and I go live on Spaces throughout the week to make sure you're up to date with everything that's happening. So that's going to be everything for this week in macro part 2. And I'm going to take a little bit of a sip of water, and then we'll be jumping straight into this week in geopolitics part 3, following the money to predict what's coming next and how we need to prepare.